Clara's Swing by Andy Lockwood. Morning woke slowly. Blades of sunlight sliced through gaps in the tree line. Sunshine cut swaths into the shadows across the lawn. As if waiting for the morning light alone, the world came to life around the farmhouse. A gentle breeze rose up from the field, swirling as it danced around a desiccated string of wind chimes. Brittle corn stalks and long dead wheat shoots leaned back against the air currents, softly creaking. The sounds of the forest came tentatively, birds and forest critters moving slowly as the chill of dawn evaporated. The sound of leaves rushing against one another began as a whisper as they played in the churning current, building to a raucous cheer that all but drowned out the morning songbirds. It was easy to get wrapped up in the blur of sound and motion, but Clara hardly noticed. Night abandoned the day, and with it Clara appeared to the world again, her tether the sunbeams that passed through her. She closed her eyes, pretending she could feel the warmth of the light soaking into her skin. Though she could feel neither heat nor cold, the nights passed slower than the days. She preferred the days. She opened her eyes again and stared out across the fields, her face an impassive mask, her posture indicating apathy and disinterest. An aged wooden plank dangled from a dry, rotted rope, swaying listlessly. The broken swing looked like it desperately wanted to drift further, were it not anchored by the remnant of braid being devoured by the earth. It held to the seat, the line between earth and the suspension branch loose and brittle, but by some miracle still holding fast. Clara watched the swing move and considered that this was the most life she had seen in this small clearing in... How long had it been? She couldn't recall. Time passed differently after she died. It had been long enough that she had forgotten much of her life. In her defense, it had been a short affair, and long ago. That much knowledge remained. Otherwise, her memory contained very little. She had vague recollections of being a child, memories of emotions, carefree, happy, loving, loved. Though the actual value of those emotions evaporated shortly after her own lifespan ceased. Only the definitive line between her life and her death contained memory and sentiment. Even that was eroding as time slipped further into the ether, like sand dancing along invisible tides. She watched the pained and brittle motion of the broken swing and dipped into her memory with impactful clarity. Though she could feel neither temperature nor emotion, Clara shuddered anyway. She had swung so high that day, it seemed possible to launch into the clouds and never come back down again. It might have been such possibilities drifting through her mind that placed the added strain on the ropes that kept her suspended in motion on the wooden plank seat. Each time she sat down, she clung to life by a literal frayed rope and had never been any wiser. But death is a patient teacher. Clara learned the lesson in her own time. The moments that yawned into the time after were the most vivid in her non-corporeal memory. There had been no flash before her eyes, no ray of light to call her home. There had only been a quiet snap, first from the swing, then from Clara, followed by an unfathomable void. Her first recognition after death was the sunrise, though she could hardly comprehend it at first. It crawled up the sky, stabbing through the tree line. She stared at it without squinting. It lacked the brilliance she remembered. Even in its cloudless intensity, it shone bland and vague across the fields. Morning rose, and as sight returned, she saw the world itself held the same pallor. The vibrance the world exhaled was no longer there, at least not in any capacity Clara could detect. With slow realization, Clara knew she would not see her family again, at least not as a member of the family she had loved. She watched from the yard, staring impassively at the house she grew up in. She knew she should feel something, even if she did not comprehend the words. She felt nothing for her home, nothing for the family she left behind. Loss was a human emotion, and Clara was no longer human. She could still feel anger, though. It did not burn bright and hot like it did in her living heart, but it was a warm ember within her. It was the only emotion she was able to kindle. She glowered at the broken swing as it defied inevitability, dangling from the single rope that still held fast. The ember within her brightened whenever she stared at the swing. She expected it to build brighter the longer she glowered, but the anger was lukewarm, easily quenched by what might once have been sadness. So she folded her arms across her empty chest and turned her back on the tree. In the early days of her afterlife, she wandered the farm in listless desperation, hoping something might raise a call within her. She followed her father in the fields as he tried to keep the farm going. She watched her mother wallow in her loss. Still, Clara searched for some emotional resonance, anything that might stir something in her, anything but the damnable swing. Instead, animals gave her a wide berth, anxious and avoidant. Nothing else seemed to pay her any mind. Her parents continued to ignore her as their beautiful home fell to shambles. The days became an uneventful blur, but the nights were a prolonged torment. The darkness was all but impenetrable, and she could see nothing of where she wandered. With nothing to see, she usually remained in place, but time in that same place led her to try anything different. Different was not necessarily better. No matter how far she wandered through the night, when the sun rose, Clara was never far from the place she died. It was her anchor to this world, and that clarity made the embers within glow brighter. Though she tried, the farmhouse lacked emotional register. Thoughts of her childhood and family were vague tendrils that swirled outside the focus of her mind. Even now, she could recall having a mother and father, but beyond that, she could find no association deep enough to feel anything about them. Most days were spent in a relative likeness to standing, waiting absently for something else. While there was a stirring need to change her vantage, there was no point in straying too far from the tree. She would return to it in the morning, whether she wanted to or not. At some point, her parents left the farm for somewhere new, probably somewhere without all the memory and emotion Clara herself couldn't access. She watched time and weather pick apart the house, the barn, the swing. They worked methodically together, first stripping the color from the paint, then peeling the paint itself away. It plucked at the individual fibers of the rope swing, stealing splinters one at a time from the wooden seat. Time chewed at the nails that held the barn walls up. One by one, Clara watched the pieces fall away. With no one to put it back together again, the farm fell to pieces like Humpty Dumpty. Still, she waited, leashed to the tree, uncertain what she was waiting for, and uncertain why she didn't just move on. One day the uncertainty faded, and a new wondering began. Strange men and stranger machines came to the place that had once been a farm. The machines toiled at the earth, digging up what little evidence remained of her former life. They dug until a large hole existed, approximately where the farmhouse once stood. From that hole, a new house slowly emerged. Clara could feel details scratching at her memory, still eluding the fore of her thoughts. She watched the house emerge from a skeleton of sticks. She was fascinated with the sudden bustle of life around her. It was almost easy to ignore the yawning expanse of eternity slipping by for a while. She wandered the new growth around the property, ignoring the strange specters that inhabited the grounds. She had no interest in these men, but was fascinated by the construction. She wandered the house as it filled in, still able to pass through the walls as effortlessly when they were finished as she did when they were only framework. It became a game, and she felt something other than anger creep into her spirit. She chased the men through the structure as they worked. From this unassuming game, she found that some part of her was bolstered. Not the girl she was, but the girl she became in this other world. Their existence returned fascination to her own. As they worked, she played, and out of idle play, she discovered her power. It was a childish whirl of her arms, but the cup moved as if she bumped it. No one had been near the table. No one was close enough to disturb it. She stared at the flimsy cup, spilling its contents all over the unfinished floor. She looked around. No one seemed to pay her any mind, the same as always. But in her own mind, a new game emerged, one of mischief and delight. For the first time in her new life, she smiled. She found what she had been seeking. With effort and determination and plenty of practice, she could jostle objects. It was more rewarding to push things off the ledges upstairs. Their contents splashed and shattered at greater heights. It made the days brighter and passed too quickly, but the men stopped coming. The house stopped being built. Construction hadn't finished, but ended all the same. The pulse of life that she had become dependent on was suddenly gone. She sat in the unfinished bones of the house, the warm glow within her replaced by the old embers of anger. Clara watched the long shadows crawl through the structure until there was nothing left to see. She sat in the darkness, brooding, certain of what she'd find come sunrise. When morning came, she was still alone, and back in the company of her derelict swing. The light and joy gone, she remained, watching with anger and muddling complacency as her hand passed through the dangling seat of the swing. No matter how desperately she swung her fist, it moved unimpeded through the swing, leaving her with nothing but to resume her ceaseless brooding. She languished so long that she hardly noticed the house come to completion. It was an element of the background, like the turning of seasons, best ignored as her focus grew vague once again. Clara sank into the tide of time. Except she didn't. Even when she was ready to give up on the world around her, she wasn't permitted to simply fade away. When she was finally ready to slip from this world once and for all, a family came to her private refuge. A mother, father, and little girl. She watched them as they stared at her, through her. Clara swore she felt a single heartbeat in her chest the first time she beheld them, like a gasp of surprise from her former life. She observed the little girl, certain she must be the same age that Clara was when she died, but Clara felt so much older now. Still, she watched, mesmerized, as the father stepped through her to cut down the old broken swing and drag it away. Together, the family cleared away the overgrowth and returned Clara's hideaway to some semblance of its former glory, perhaps even better than it once had been. It was so long ago, who could recall? Though she had done nothing to deserve it, the young girl had captured Clara's attention. She would find the girl in the morning, following her throughout the day. Sometimes the family would leave the property, somewhere Clara could not follow. She would wait by the swing. When she wasn't careful, the days slipped away from her in the waiting, but the family always returned. Clara pursued the girl relentlessly, following her wherever she could be found. One day, the girl started looking back at her. They had been in the field, the young girl picking flowers. Clara hadn't done anything unusual. She was standing, staring, observing with interest and a bit of envy. She took note of the new sensation within her. She had felt so many new emotions since the family arrived. Clara almost didn't register as the girl sat back and stared with wide, clear eyes. Again, Clara could practically feel the pulse of life in her non-existent heart. The living girl stumbled backward, and Clara followed. The girl took a few steps forward, and Clara retreated. Escalating, they pursued each other across the grounds, neither one able to speak with the other, but playing a game the both of them understood on a deeper level. Clara found some semblance of humanity in friendship with her corporeal companion. But each night the living girl returned to her house and her family, and Clara would return to her tree, whether she wanted to or not. She never slept, but stared into the dark, watching the lights blink out of the house each evening. Eventually she'd be reduced to darkness once again, desperately impatient for morning. Summer became autumn, and autumn turned to winter. The girl came less, and the darkness came more. Clara stared into the darkness, feeling the anger glow within her. Her gaze bore into the dark house as she stood on the lawn like a forgotten pup. She lost sight of the days and nights all the same. She only saw the shape of the house before her. Her only companions were the memory of her broken swing and the growing anger. She didn't know how long she stared hatred into the house, but when she finally turned away, something new hung where the old swing had been. The new swing glimmered, seeming to mock her as it dangled from silver chains instead of uncertain rope. Clara stared, uncertain of its meaning. Was this meant for her? She reached out, closing ghostly fingers around the reliable length of chain. She should have expected, but still found herself both surprised and disappointed when her hand passed right through the links suspending the seat. The dead girl turned her attention back to the house, wondering when they had returned to the tree and why they mocked her now. The sun was still scaling the house, a new day just beginning. She focused her attention, not wanting to miss this day. She waited motionless, letting the world happen around her. Shadows withered as the sun climbed to its zenith. The door of the house finally opened, the girl emerging, skipping down the steps. She was taller than the last time Clara had seen her. She had curves, and with each step she bounced with vigor and life. She crossed the lawn, slowing to a stroll. She moved with grace. And though Clara could see she was still more child than adult, that margin was closing. Clara watched her aging companion clip between the lengths of chain, pulling the swing back with her as she raised her legs. She didn't notice Clara at all. She swung back and forth, daydreaming as her legs moved lazily beneath her. She rocked like a pendulum. Each shift of her legs drove her further out into an arc over the grass. each movement passing flesh and blood through her non-corporeal observer. Clara felt the sensation rise within her again. She was relieved to feel something, afraid she might have lost it in the time they'd been apart. The sensation was vibrant and impossible to ignore, more powerful than she had ever felt on this side of life. She could feel every wisp of her form vibrating with the energy it gave her. She wanted to be seen. No, she wanted to exist. She wanted the life that had been ripped away from her. It wasn't fair that she was forced to wait an eternity in this place while this stranger could live carefree where she might grow up and someday leave the boundary Clara was confined to. She watched the girl, knuckles white as they held tight to the chains, legs pistoned as she moved higher up the arc of the swing. Clara felt her unperceived form vibrate with energy, a warmth growing within her. She had no idea what it meant, but the longer she stared at the girl on the swing with her ecstatic smile and the rushing breeze teasing through her hair, the more Clara felt herself quake with agency. It was not the comfortable warmth of sunshine and happy days. It was a fire that blazed within her, hot and unforgiving. The girl swung again, arcing upward, pointed toes harpooning the dead girl. She leaned forward, tucking her legs under her as she rocketed back to the earth. A human wrecking ball, she plowed through the uneasy spirit again, moving back to the beginning of her swing. Clara watched the other girl straighten her legs as she reached the top of the arc. The girl leaned back and began her descent. Clara felt a moment present itself, opening to her like a present. She wasted no time responding to it. She put her hand out as the girl dove into the low arc of the swing. Clara looked into the smiling, blissful face, and all of the agony and energy that had been collecting within her unleashed in a single, spiteful moment. The veil between spirit and flesh tore, pierced through with haste and determination. Blood continued its course through now lifeless veins as the body toppled into the grass.